Oil is needed for the tractors and the transport used in agriculture, and of course, as fuel for cooking. And what about the fertilizers and the pesticides? Oil again. And then there's storage, processing, and often oil-based packaging as well. It can take up to 70 milliliters of oil to produce a 100-gram pork chop. It's nearly double that for a 100-gram pack of cheese. A tomato grown in a greenhouse can use more than 1/3 of a liter of oil. But the predictions are that the oil which has enabled our increasingly intensive and mechanized modern farming techniques will not last forever. And we've already had warnings in the shape of increasing oil prices. Oil hit a record $147 a barrel in 2008. It helped to push food inflation up to double figures. Some fear that oil prices could reach $200 per barrel in the years ahead. So what effect could a drastic drop-off in oil supply have on food production? One country that may have the answer has already experienced the kind of oil shock predicted for the rest of the world: Cuba. Until 1989, Cuba exchanged its abundant sugar production for cheap, imported subsidized oil from the Eastern Bloc. In fact, it was so cheap that Cuba pursued a highly industrialized, fuel-thirsty form of agriculture. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the supply of crude oil went down by about 50%, with dramatic implications for food production. It was as if the oil tap was suddenly turned off.
All those subsidies we received from abroad, and especially oil, was reduced, and the economy basically collapsed. We had to grow food with less oil, and the farming systems were adapted to that. We had to change from very conventional agriculture to a more self-sufficient and locally based agriculture, counting on the resources that we had at that moment.
Fernando Funes is working on a new low-oil, high-yield approach to farming that may have lessons for us all in the future. It certainly looks very different to the vast single-crop fields you see in other parts of the world. Here, there are rows of several plants growing side by side. Animals can be reared on farm waste, and they are also used to work the land. It's like agricultural mix and match. Every bit of land is used, maximizing production.
This kind of farming that combines crops, many different crops, and livestock and so on, is able to capture energy from sun and to make a better use of water and nutrients. In the conventional way of farming, about 5 calories are necessary to produce 1 calorie in terms of products. In this kind of farming, biodiversity makes possible to produce about 5 per 1 calorie input.
Using Fernando's calculations, that would make this kind of low-oil polycropping approach to agriculture 25 times more efficient than industrialized modern farming. You don't use fuel-thirsty tractors. Actually, you couldn't fit them in between the rows of plants. And you can produce a lot of food in a small area. But this kind of farming is not a miracle solution to a fuel shortage. A return to what many would see as a pre-industrialized form of agriculture worldwide would require millions more people to work the land and a dramatic rise in the price of food. Cuba didn't have any choice but to adapt its farming techniques in this way, and the loss of oil to the agricultural sector hasn't been without consequence. One of the first casualties was the range of food that had been available for people to eat. Whilst Cubans have an intake of calories not much below the United States, much of the Cuban diet is made up of vegetables and pulses. Cubans get about 3 times less of their food energy from animal products like meat and dairy than the average Western country. "20 years after the oil crisis, and despite the changing diet and adapted agricultural processes, Cuba still imports about half of its food. A fuel shock can quite quickly become a food shock. So, if, as some believe, global oil reserves are now under threat, we may have to completely rethink our heavily mechanized form of agriculture. Oil not only provides fuel for agricultural vehicles, it fuels over 600 million automobiles worldwide. One alternative to oil-based fuel is fuel made with plants and grain. Enthusiasm for these so-called biofuels has grown as oil prices have risen and climate change fears escalated. But some believe that this is another and very serious threat to food security. India has embraced the idea of biofuels in recent years. But in a country where just a 10% rise in the cost of food means another 40 million people are pushed into poverty, it's a controversial policy. This field is planted with jatropha. There's quite a buzz about it in environmental circles. It's seen as the latest renewable alternative to fossil fuel. It's being grown in Chhattisgarh in central India, an area now dubbed India's biofuel state. Before jatropha was planted, 18 families used to get food from this field, which was regarded as common land. The local farmers had their crops uprooted by the authorities. They are now relying on food handouts. The villagers have been joining forces to resist the planting of jatropha.
तो ये जमीन सरकार की जमीन है, सरकार ने जरूरत रही तो छोड़ दो, नहीं तो नहीं छोड़ना, ये कहीं के उत्का में काबिज रही नहीं.
The villagers have ripped up some of the jatropha, but it's been replanted. Ajit Eka has been jailed for her resistance. She and other villagers vow to fight on.
रतन जोत से हमको ये समस्या है कि रतन जोत तो एक लकड़ी नहीं है, हाँ, ना उसको हम लोग जला नहीं सकते हैं, हमारे गरीब किसान मजदूर लोग जला नहीं सकते, ना उसका फल नहीं खा सकते, ना उसका यूज कुछ नहीं कर सकते, क्योंकि गरीब मजदूर तो अपने रोजी कहीं भी जाके अपना कमा के लकड़ी या कहीं जला सकते हैं. और रतन जोत ऐसी चीज़ है कि उसमें तेल निकालेंगे, यदि उसको पेट्रोल बनाएंगे तो इनके पास तो गाड़ी नहीं है, तो गाड़ी नहीं है तो इन लोग कहाँ से उसमें पेट्रोल जला देंगे. इसलिए हमारी कहना है कि जब रतन जो तो यदि फलेगी उसको बकरी भी खाती है या बैल भी खाता है तो मर जाता है. इसमें हमारी बहुत ही समस्या है.
India wants 20% of the nation's diesel fuel to come from crops in just 8 years' time. This would require an additional 14 million hectares of land. The Indian government says that land used to feed the population should not be used to grow crops for fuel. But there have been many reported cases of farmers around the developing world being thrown off their land.
What we have in the world today is an emerging competition between cars and people for the world's grain supply.